All right, hey everybody, Miss Lynch here. So this is the second half of chapter 15, the lecture. Feels more echoey in here than it did last time, that's okay. Hopefully you can hear me better with this old microphone going. Okay, so when we left off chapter 15, we were talking about kind of the failure of land reform and the establishment of the sharecropping and cropland systems that put African American farmers and poor Caucasian farmers into kind of this perpetuated system of poverty. And so that's where I believe I left off. My goal the other day was to hop right back on, and that didn't happen. So here I am. Apologize if I am skipping anything or repeating what I already said. Anyway, okay. Well, let's get into it. You should have your textbook in front of you. You know the drill, hopefully. Have your textbook in front of you, something to write with and something to write on, aka your notebook. Okay. Then you should have this PowerPoint or slideshow pulled up in front of you. And I think the last thing we talked about was, in fact, Andrew Johnson, kind of his demeanor and, you know, all that fun stuff. So I'm pretty sure I said this. He considered himself to be a champion of the honest Yemen and not large planters. And he, in actuality, which you can go back and look at that photo, he was referred to as lonely, stubborn, and intolerant of criticism. And he, in fact, believed that African Americans played no role in Reconstruction whatsoever, which is pretty evident in his policy making. So you can look into that, which, I mean, we talked about that. Okay, so end of Civil War through 1867 is referred to as Federal Reconstruction, and then the beginning of this next time period, this takes us into Radical Reconstruction. Alrighty, our next slide, we have the Black Codes, as they were referred to. So Southern governments began passing new laws that restricted the freedom of former slaves, and this is done in a lot of different capacities, in a lot of different ways, so we'll kind of get into that. But, all right. So former slaves are freedmen during the 1860s were granted certain rights, such as legalized and recognized marriage, which had not existed prior to this, the ownership of property, and some access to courts. However, although there was some access to courts, the court system, there were a lot of rights that were still denied. Okay, so for example, like the right to testify against any Caucasian person. All right, African Americans were also not allowed, to serve on juries or in state militias. And a big one for us, which we'll continue to talk about, but they were not allowed to vote, which will lead to future amendments. But so those are kind of the certain aspects that are trying to be limited, all right, by lawmakers. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move right along. Okay, Radical Republicans. So Radical Republicans called for the dissolution of Johnson's state governments, and they wished to have new governments put in place that did not have, as you can see, this is here in quotes, quote unquote rebels in power, and also to give African Americans the right to vote. Okay? So the Radical Republicans, this is really considered to be kind of the origin of the Civil Rights Movement, which the Civil Rights Movement, as we know it, happens, 1950s, 1960s, but so this is that first wave. We'll have another wave of it closer to World War II, and then what we kind of know today. But so this is the beginning of the Civil Rights Organization as a movement, a little bit. And looking at these Republicans in the South, it's good to know that most of them were moderate and not these radicals, like I had mentioned on the previous slide. And there is a proposition that comes about during this time from Senator Trumbull out of Illinois, that we see here. And a lot of people wanted to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau And then also, this introduced what is known as the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. And the main principle behind that is that equality before the law was central, and it defined all persons born in the United States as citizens and spelled out rights that everyone was to enjoy regardless of race. Okay, and so in addition, this would also make the black codes illegal. Okay, kind of so going off of that, looking at the next slide. So those were the proposals. Johnson vetoed them. You know, going back to what I said a second ago, he did not feel like African Americans had any role to play in Reconstruction and rebuilding the South. So why would they, you know, be given these rights, is how he viewed it. So he vetoes those bills. And not only was voting a concern of his, as I'll put it, he also felt at his core that African Americans did not deserve the right of citizenship altogether, not just the ability to vote, but to be considered citizens. Thankfully, Congress went ahead and they passed, you know, like I said, the Civil Rights Bill of 1866. This happens in April. And it went on to extend some of the operations of the Freedmen's Bureau, which we will see. Okay, so this conversation's happening about what needs to be going on, and civil rights enters the conversation, and this leads to the creation of the 14th Amendment. Okay, Congress drafted this. Pardon me. It placed in the Constitution the principle of citizenship, basically what I am repeating from a moment ago, but placed in the Constitution the principle of citizenship for all persons born in the U.S. and protected the rights of all Americans. But this will not include voting rights. We'll have to wait on that. So this did not provide for African American suffrage. And this was considered to be the most important change in the Constitution since the adoption of the Bill of Rights. And pretty much everybody except Tennessee refused to adopt this or to ratify it. Okay. Is the 14th Amendment. And then in March 1867, we have the Reconstruction Act. So over Johnson's veto, Congress adopted this act, and it divided the South into 5 military zones, which that military division marks the beginning of radical Reconstruction. And it called for the creation of new state governments and also giving the voting right to African American men. Okay. Oh, I'm just repeating myself here. Like I said, the Reconstruction Act marked the beginning of radical Reconstruction, that division into the military zones. And this would go on until 1877, which is the end date of our chapter, so that's how you know. End of an era. Okay, moving right along, we have a picture here of U.S. Grant. So there he is, and then if we scroll down, we will talk about him. Okay, so the election of 1868, U.S. Grant won by a slim margin. And the following year, Congress approved the 15th Amendment. So drafts this, it's adopted by the states the following year, and it provided for African American suffrage. Like I said, the 14th Amendment did not do this, so we get it here with the 15th. And it prohibited federal and state governments from denying any citizen the right to vote based on race. All right, so this is a very important piece of legislation. Okay, and then let's look at this next slide. Alrighty. It did, in fact, have many loopholes, which will be a theme for us. We'll see some of those loopholes. And so states could actually discriminate on bases other than race. And this included things like illiteracy and the inability to pay particular taxes. So that's how poll taxes come about. So whenever you hear today that, you know, having people, you have to have a driver's license to be able to go vote. And people say that's a poll tax because you're charging people, I don't know what it is to get a license now, 25 bucks, charging people this $25 fee in order to be able to vote, even though you're saying it's not technically about voting at all. Anyway, these are just ways that some governments were trying to limit rights for African Americans in the South, okay? All right, also, with a loophole, again, we'll see this later down the road, but voting rights do not extend to women during this point in time. So we won't see that until after the turn of the century. Okay, but during this era, there is this increase in offices being held by African Americans, and so yes, and the majority of these were actually former slaves during this point in time. So former slaves receiving some political rights and entering public offices. So this section is entitled The African American Office Holder. And so 2,000 African Americans occupied public offices during Reconstruction, both phases of it, federal and radical. So 14 individuals are elected to the House of Reps. 2 are elected to the U.S. Senate. And it's important, this is so important because the presence of African American office holders and Caucasian allies made this, led to this significant difference in Southern life, okay, creating somewhat of a sense of fairness in some aspects, right? Particularly in local governing and in trials, right? I talked about, anyway, lots of different stipulations, like I said, all over the place, trying to limit these rights. So with these office holders, like I said, it creates a little bit more of a balance, right? And as I said before as well, the majority of state and local office holders were in fact former slaves. Okay, so Southern Republicans. Our Southern Republican governments during this time established the South's first state-supported public schools, so there's a big push for education. They also pioneered civil rights legislation. Like I said a second ago, this was the beginning of kind of that dialogue of, you know, what are civil rights? So with the beginning of that conversation, it was also made illegal for railroads, hotels, and other institutions to discriminate based on race. Excuse me. And, you know, again, loopholes and enforcement for these issues kind of varies depending on where you are at. So, yeah, just on that, enforcement varied, but established for the first time at the state level a standard of equal citizenship. So it's introducing these ideas into a dialogue for everyone, all right? We'll kind of get into this more, but so this is looking at the section, The Quest for Prosperity. Railroad construction really begins during this time and will continue throughout the rest of the century. So in the next chapter, we'll get into that more. And the idea of railroad construction and this industry was kind of seen as economic or key to the economic development in the South, particularly in helping to build factories, moving away from the plantation model of forced labor, bringing in the northern example of factory paid labor. Okay, so factories, this leads to bustling towns, so communities on these near railways, okay? And with that, it also allows agriculture to become diversified. With the railroad, other crops are able to come in and out, and the South moves away from just cotton or tobacco or sugar, depending on where you're at, all right? So diversification in agriculture. Like I said, this will go through this chapter and on into the next, but really development is kind of weak during this time, and we'll get into that more, okay? So, like I said, there is this increase in political action coming from many members of the African American community in the South, and as a result of that, many embittered Caucasian racist Southerners who were still upset about the outcomes of the Civil War take up arms, and it leads to this spike in violence in the South that is not just in this chapter. Everything I say, there's a theme. It's going to show up again. We really see it here. We'll see it in the 1920s. We'll see it in the 1950s. But this is really the start of a lot of that organization, okay? So Republican presence in the South led to more organized opposition. So this really begins in 1868, so a couple years after the war. And a lot, like I said, those Caucasian Southerners who still were very much racist in their ways and had it out for the African American community in the South, began organizing secret societies. And this is how the KKK is developed, the Ku Klux Klan, which begins in 1866, so pretty soon after the war. And a big focus for this group was to limit any political power, any voting rights, and destroying the Republican Party that was trying to kind of rebuild the South, okay? So there are instances like the Colfax, Louisiana massacre, which occurred in 1873. And this is where hundreds of former slaves, which included 50 African-American militiamen, were captured by Caucasian Southerners, gathered up. They surrendered, and this group of African Americans surrendered, and these Caucasians massacred them, okay? So this is, like I said, this is just the beginning of a different era of violence in the South, this domestic terrorism, okay? So between Congress, U.S. Grant, there was the passage of 3 different enforcement acts between 1870 and 1871, and this effectively shut down the KKK for, kind of a generation. So the KKK ends for a little while, but by 1872, and what these acts did was they outlawed terrorist societies, and they permitted the president to call in federal troops if necessary. So looking back at Colfax and that massacre, situations like that, okay, this gave the president that power. Okay. The zeal, the commitment that came at the beginning stages of Reconstruction really begins to kind of fade during the 1870s. And many Northerners who had supported this to begin with really began to feel like the Southern states should be able to solve their own problems, okay, pull themselves back up. So Grant is reelected in 1872. There is the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1875. So this outlawed racial discrimination in places of public accommodation. So going off of the previous Civil Rights Act. But so this act, the Civil Rights Act of 1875, this is the final piece of Reconstruction legislation, all right? Okay, and then this last little bit, so this is what I've been saying, and this will be something we continue to talk about. So the Supreme Court whittled away at African Americans' rights through different court cases. Okay, so thinking about those poll taxes, thinking about literacy tests, okay? So we start seeing these things being chipped away at. There's the end of Reconstruction in 1877. And in some states, rights were continued to be given to African Americans in regards to voting. So African Americans continued to be able to vote, participate in politics, like holding office and stuff like that. That will continue a little bit until the 1890s, and by that point in time, it's kind of just become the general tone of the South that anything that was kind of afforded to former slaves following the Civil War has kind of been diminished at that point. Okay, and so that is really where this chapter ends and then sends us into chapter 16, which is about the Gilded Age, which, you know, has its own set of problems and issues. So we'll get into that. But if you guys have any questions about this stuff, please email me. I'll get chapter 16 up in 2 lectures, part 1 and part 2 for you by Tuesday, so you'll definitely have that before class. And then I think I'm finally starting to pick up a little bit of a pace. So I feel like I've been behind where you guys are. I'm finally catching up to where you need to be, and hopefully I will be ahead of you starting from like next week on. I think that's it for now. Like I said, reach out, let me know if you need anything, any questions about this or anything at all. I'm here. Okay. Have a good weekend, and I'll talk to you guys when I talk to you. Okay, bye.